Hi, everyone. I'm Nancy Hawk, Executive Director of Basic Rights Oregon. Welcome to our weekly Queer Town Hall, where we join in discussion around issues that matter to you and to all of us, not just locally, but on a national level as well. When we were thinking about this Queer Town Hall and focusing on the federal perspective, we were thinking about the recent Supreme Court victories, as well as the federal administration's rollback of protections in trans healthcare and homeless shelters, and we didn't know then what would be playing out now in the streets of Portland. The federal administration is yet again putting its gross injustice and brutality on display. The administration is violently sending a message of hate while suppressing democracy and freedom in the process. And at this point, it seems obvious the cruelty and the hatred is the point. It's the name of the game for this administration, and they're using Portland as a testing ground for the rest of the country. But we continue existing and resisting and fighting back. And our strength is in our community, which is why we've gathered this incredible panel here today to talk about what's happened recently in federal LGBTQ rights, where we're headed, and what this means for us here in Oregon. So, as always, if you'd like to ask a question, please do so as a YouTube comment. Everyone who comments or donates today will be entered into a drawing for one of our Protect Trans Kids tote bags, and all donations will go towards covering the cost of live captioning the Queer Town Hall. So let's get started with our amazing panelists. So as always, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves with your name, your pronouns, the work you do in the world, and one positive thing you've learned from spending so much time at home during these past 5 months. And I'm going to go in alphabetical order, starting with Ian.
Well, thank you very much, Nancy, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. My name is Ian Thompson. I'm a senior legislative representative for the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. And in that capacity, I am the ACLU's primary federal legislative advocate on issues impacting the LGBTQ community. As far as something positive I've learned about spending so much time at home during this period, I would say that it definitely has had many, many drawbacks, but one thing that I am grateful for is that it has afforded me more opportunity to spend time with my partner, as well as my parents who live in Pittsburgh. I've been able to spend time with them as well. So I'm grateful for those aspects.
That's great. Thank you. And we're grateful to have you. And Kylar, you made it. You made it. You're here. Let's hear about you.
Unmuting there. Sorry, getting the hang of that. I am Kylar Broadus. I have done various and sundry policy work, litigation, doing more litigation now, and excited about doing that work, and have been a professor and various other things within and outside and around the movement. And I'm excited to be here with you guys today. I have been isolated. I've actually, if people didn't know, was a germaphobe prior to the pandemic. So some people said you were already a recluse, so what makes us different? And I said choice. Choice is always important, right? Give a nod to my ACLU partner. Choice is for all of us, right, in the movement. But have been sheltering in place more, and unfortunately, I'm doing it by myself, just by where I ended up landing at the time it was happening. So it was like if I had to rethink it, I wouldn't shelter in place by myself. So. Just saying. So glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And also, you're underselling yourself a little bit. You've been on the forefront of LGBTQ rights and especially trans rights for decades, and you're one of the great leaders in our country, and so really excited to have you here. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. I just want to say my parents taught me to be a humble person, and that's what you see. I'm just a country boy from a small country town that grew up on a dirt road. So that's how I do like to introduce myself. But I'm happy to be with y'all.
Great, thank you. And it's really been germaphobes' time to shine. This pandemic. So, Matt, let's hear about you.
Hi, Nancy. Thanks so much for having this panel and for inviting me to join with so many amazing speakers. My name is Matt Dos Santos, and I'm here on behalf of the Transgender Law Center. I've been on the board of directors with the Transgender Law Center for the better part of a decade now, and have been working with the Transgender Law Center since it was at the National Center for Lesbian Rights in 2005. Really just super pleased to be here, and I'd have to say that I have, in my attempt to make myself feel less isolated and better about everything that's going on, despite how terrible it is, I have invested a lot in trips to Target to buy makeup along with my groceries, and it has been really fun practicing doing eyes, because now we have to wear masks everywhere, and the only thing that matters is our eye look out in public. So for me, it has been an elevation in makeup skills that COVID has brought me.
Well, you're looking fabulous, so thank you. And love the polka dot and the coral color, just looking good. So Nora, welcome.
Hi, so I'm a Nora broker. I'm an associate attorney at the law firm Bennett Hartman LLP in Portland. We're a labor and employment firm. I represent a lot of plaintiff side, union side. I represent teachers and nurses, and also do plaintiff side employment litigation, especially for LGBT people and trans people. I'm also on the board of OGALLA, LGBT Bar Association of Oregon, and I'm our legislative policy chair there, and do various legislative work, mostly around trans rights. And also pretty active in advocating for incarcerated trans people in Portland, or in Oregon, especially around identity documents and being recognized in the system, things like that. And we have an 11-month-old at home whose daycare shut down, so this has been a very on the positive side, it got me down 6 weeks. We're getting through.
Okay. Well, thank you, and thank you for being here. I know it's been it's a lot for parents. It's a lot of togetherness with our small people, but it's good too. So we're going to start today with a statement from Transgender Law Center, because it's pretty perfect sort of intro to what's happening at this moment. So Matt, do you want to kick us off with that statement?
Sure, thanks, Nancy. So both of the most recent and egregious anti-trans actions taken by the Trump administration, the 1557 rollback and the HUD announcement, as well as SCOTUS's Bostock ruling, must be contextualized within our current moment. A global pandemic that has taken over 130,000 lives in the US that we know of, unprecedented national unemployment that has left over 40 million people out of work and many without health care, an epidemic of police violence and murder against Black people, and a crisis of violence facing Black trans people, especially Black trans women and femmes. Whenever possible, we say the names of those lost to the twin epidemics of racist police violence and the violence against Black transgender people. We mourn those who have been murdered at the hands of the police, including George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and Rayshard Brooks. Over the past several weeks alone, our communities have suffered the loss of 6 Black transgender women, Briella Stone, Mercy Mack, Shakai Peters, Drea McCarty, Tatiana Hall, and Bree Black. Additionally, a Black trans man, Christian Roos, 18 years old, was assaulted and beaten severely. We are not all impacted equally by these concurrent crises. At all times in our words and actions, we seek to center those who are most impacted, especially Black trans women and femmes, trans people of color, trans people with disabilities, trans migrants, trans people living with HIV, and trans people living in rural regions in the U.S. South.
Great. Thank you for that. Some important contextualization of what's happening right now. So let's go ahead and get started with some questions. And folks, don't forget to write your questions for all these amazing lawyers in the YouTube comments. So why don't we get started? Matt, do you want to talk a little bit more about that ruling that seems to allow healthcare providers to discriminate against transgender people? I know TLC was quick to condemn the actions. Just tell us about what the rollback was and how it's affecting people.
Sure. So just generally speaking, talking about Section 1557 of the ACA, that's a law that expanded healthcare access for people living in the United States. Section 1557 is part of the ACA that prohibits discrimination in healthcare. Essentially, it prohibits healthcare programs from discriminating on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, age, and disability. It allows you to file complaints with federal agencies or bring claims to court when you have been discriminated against by a healthcare provider. In 2016, the Obama administration issued a rule that explained who 1557 protected from discrimination. Specifically, that rule stated that transgender people were protected by 1557's ban on sex discrimination. It also stated that programs must provide translation, interpretation, and other language services for people with limited English proficiency, and made sure that those protections applied to a broad range of businesses who work is directly related to healthcare. So that's kind of the background. And so what did the Trump administration do? So on June 12th, just about a month ago now, the Trump administration issued a new rule interpreting 1557. This rule changed the federal government's official stance on protection of gender identity, access to abortion, services for people with limited English proficiency, and who Section 1557 applies to. It erased explicit protection for transgender people from Section 1557. It changed the federal government's official stance on gender identity and access to abortion, services for people with limited English proficiency. It also the ban for sex discrimination, just to contextualize it a little bit further, was critical around abortion access because it didn't. It only covered essentially when 1557 bans sex discrimination, according to the Trump administration, that only covers discrimination against cisgendered men and women based on their gender, not discrimination against trans people because of their genders, right? And of course, now contextualized in Bostock, which came out, the Supreme Court decision, which came out just days after, this makes even less sense. But for those of us who have been working on this case prior to the issuance of Bostock, we knew it didn't make sense already, right? And I think Ian will talk to you about this, as I'm sure Nora will too, because a bunch of courts had already basically said that discrimination against trans people is part of sex discrimination. So the Trump administration's interpretation isn't supported by law, and we think is probably vulnerable to attack in the courts.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And yeah, we wanted to start on healthcare because, of course, that's the thing we get the most questions about, because there's just this big question, like, what does that mean for me, right, as a person who's trying to access healthcare? Ian, do you want to talk a little bit more about some of the implications of the healthcare law?
Yeah, well, just really kind of building off of Matt's point about how, even before the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock, the Trump administration's attempts to have a very narrow reading of sex discrimination was not supported by the law. There was decisions going back decades holding that discrimination based on sex stereotyping was a violation of the law. And then, as time went on, courts even, more clearly said that discriminating against people because they are transgender or because they are lesbian, gay, or bisexual is a violation of the law. So, the court decisions in many respects, even though it wasn't yet at the Supreme Court level, was already there to show that the Trump administration's assaults on LGBTQ people, particularly trans people, were not supported by the law. But now, given the Supreme Court's very clear decision in Bostock, which makes absolutely clear that discriminating against individuals based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity, in other words, right, discriminating against people because they're LGBTQ is a violation of sex discrimination prohibitions in federal law, specifically in that case, the prohibition on workplace discrimination in Title VII. So we've gone from a place where the Trump administration's interpretation was really not supported by the law to now the Trump administration's anti-LGBTQ regulations, many of them, I would say, are in direct conflict with the law. And that is a point that both advocates as well as pro-equality members of Congress have been lifting up in the weeks since the Supreme Court's decision, pointing out to the administration that much of the regulatory assault over the past 4 years on LGBTQ people is now in direct conflict with the law.
Mm-hmm. So it feels like, and for me, not being a lawyer, but just sort of noticing things, like it feels like the Trump administration keeps doing things that don't actually make sense given what the laws are and given what, but yeah, it strikes a lot of fear in people, right? Just like these federal troops in Oregon right now, in Portland, strike a lot of fear in people. And, so it's like, the administration says, oh, we're going to take this away. And then we have a Supreme Court decision that's seems to be contrary. And people are left sort of not really understanding what's going to happen when they go to the doctor and what's going to happen when they try to access insurance, right? And so just sort of thinking about people who are watching, what do you recommend they do? If because it feels like what comes up most is insurance not covering trans-related health care, right? Which is discrimination. What should folks do? I'm going to let whoever wants to answer.
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in since I disappeared and came back. That was magic, by the way. So, no, the city's on my laptop apparently couldn't work, so they were accommodating me on theirs that went out. But I think people should not kowtow to fear mongering. I think that is what this administration is all about, and we should not buy into it. And we should go about and utilize our services. We have these great lawyers working on our behalf. Many we know Ian works with a bunch, and I myself and Matt and I forget, I have not met this wonderful person on the phone, and I forget names. I hate to admit I'm at that age, but since we've already mentioned decades, I was trying to hide that so I could get in at 22. But we need not, as I make jokes, which always help us through, the sincereness is we need to stop the fear mongering. And that has been my frame with this person, number 45, from the beginning. And we have allowed it, which has moved us into spaces that were very uncomfortable. And not saying the movement, but a society as a whole has allowed it and given this person too much space to do that. And I'm glad our community has stood strong on certain issues and moved forward. And our litigators have been our fiercest warriors in doing that. And hopefully warriors doesn't offend anyone. But, you know, I'd like to use, I just did a piece yesterday with two folks that I've done a lot of work with for years, Jennifer Levi and Shannon Mentor, who headed the litigation with sorry, I'm back at Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but the trans in the military ban. And I've worked organizing around that issue. And we're doing well, thanks to actually the Supreme Court ruling we were just talking about. And Ian mentioned the case law that had been building, that we kept getting that ruled in favor of trans people doing these things. And we were able to still show that, you know, trans people don't interfere with the readiness of the military. We've done that work on the last watch of the previous president, and all that work thrashes through, and there are other militaries that have trans people and are doing just fine. And we see these inconsistencies with this administration, which we shouldn't buy into. We should continue to believe in ourselves, believe in who we are, and love ourselves, and continue our fight forward. Because we have some very competent people on this call that I've worked with, you know, Ian being one, and these other lovely people, and you and Bro, who I've known for years, that does outstanding work in the Northwest. And I've been favored to come there and enjoy being with you. I haven't been with you personally, but I know the work you do, and it's fabulous up there. And we have a great system to continue. So let's believe in ourselves and not by the hype we hear every day on the news. Let's listen to our own internal system and build up that system within each other, and be brave and strong.
Yeah.
Because we're winning, folks. We're winning. So.
Thank you. Nora, do you want to be brave and weigh in?
Yeah, kind of going in response, kind of specifically on just practical things. If somebody is facing a denial, just from the litigator standpoint and winding these, you know, this ruling is great in terms of assuring that you do what our rights are, and that these denials are going to be in violation of the law. You need to appeal through the administrative process. If you get that denial piece of paper, you know, hit with a highlighter every deadline and make sure you meet those, because, you know, from our end, that's one of the things that you run into frequently. Somebody has something denied and they haven't met a deadline, and even though their rights were violated, you know, we've lost our chance to fight that. And also speaking to an attorney as soon as possible really is great too, because you also have other deadlines such as litigation deadlines, you know, statute of limitations. Oregon, a lot of our statute of limitations are really short, or at least, well, some of them have been made better recently, but like those things are going to be critical to being able to actually assert your rights. You know, and the hope is that those appeals are going to change their mind without having to actually go through a litigation process. But a former colleague of mine, Talia Guerriero, recently, in partnership with NCLR, recently achieved a settlement
for a trans woman here in Oregon to get facial feminization surgery covered by her Blue Cross insurance, that had to go all the way to litigation, and CLR was great stepping in to support that. But as you go through that process, there's a lot of boxes to check, and just don't sit on it, don't wait, and make sure that you're clear on when your deadlines are. And it's just probably one of the most practical things to keep in mind.
And can I jump in really quickly, Nancy, with something else?
Yes.
So thank you so much, and thanks for mentioning Talia's case, Nora. The thing that I would just sort of emphasize is that if you think you've been discriminated against, you can still file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, with US DOJ. I think it's fair for us to assume that US DOJ, at least some of the folks, are taking their orders from the Trump administration, but a lot of kind of line level attorneys are still trying to do their jobs, right? And they're still trying to follow the law, and they still understand how Bostock is going to have implications on these rules. And you can also, as Nora said, you can, and as Kylar said, you can sue insurance companies under the ACA still. But here in Oregon, we have more protections, right? So we're not just limited to 1557. We have state and some local protections, like in Portland and metro areas. And those aren't affected by the federal rule. So if I was sort of thinking about this from a federal landscape, I would be telling the people in, Kentucky and Missouri and places that don't have the same kind of state protections to not give up, as Kylar said, and to remember that these insurance companies are behemoths and they take a long time to change their internal rules. But folks who are here in Oregon or in New York or Massachusetts or places or California where there are good local protections, in some ways 1557 and those rule changes just will not, I don't want to say they won't impact us, right? Because they encourage bigoted transphobia. And I think people will take their cues from that. But they don't have the same legal ramifications at the local level.
And if I could just say, that's a really important point that Matt lifts up, and thank you, Matt, for highlighting, the fact that there are many states that have very strong protections in place. That's certainly true in a state like Oregon. And I would also add that it is important to remember that the Trump administration can, choose to put out, deeply transphobic regulations, but they are not entitled to actually change the underlying law at issue. And the Affordable Care Act is very clear that discrimination based on sex in healthcare is illegal. And now with the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock, that we'll have to see how this plays out in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. But there is absolutely no reason to believe that a sex discrimination prohibition in a healthcare context would be viewed differently by courts than a prohibition on sex discrimination in the workplace context, or in the education context, or in the housing context. These are all areas under federal law where sex discrimination is currently prohibited. And there's absolutely every reason to believe that courts, because of the Bostock decision, will hold that anti-LGBTQ discrimination in those other spaces is likewise illegal sex discrimination under federal law.
And Ian, thanks for bringing those points out and making it clear that the court is likely to do that. That's wonderful on you and Matt for bringing out local protections, and that the ruling from the Bostock decision will likely hold true in all those other areas, which gives people hope in states that don't have those protections. So, and I want to go back to Nora, who I have your name right now, Nora, and say thank you for giving people legitimate steps to follow through, appeal, and pay attention to those deadlines. And I want to go back to if you're in the states that don't have any of those things, get to a lawyer, back to Nora's point, right away, because we have lawyers in those states, and if not, call some of the major national orgs and they will get you to lawyers in those states, because we do now have many more than when I started and was the lawyer in the whole Midwest that drove around, which is why I have a new back in, by the way, which is why you haven't seen me in a while, Ian, because I drove the circuit literally in many states just to enter to protect LGBT people. And now we have lots of people, thank goodness, in states that can provide help and assistance and are more than willing to. I'm finding people that are just contacting me that that's great, because I used to ask people to do stuff and they're like, huh? And now they're like, do you need pro bono assistance doing this, that, and the other? So we have the help to do this work. So come forward, like Nora said, and get the assistance and do it right away.
And thank you, Kylar. And I wanted to follow up on what Matt mentioned about local protections, because it is a problem that we've actually run into a lot at the local level, even in states like Oregon, is there can be confusion about whether or not there could be confusion before about whether our state laws actually applied to things like exclusions in health insurance plans. That has been cleaned up by Bostock and that we don't have to deal with anymore. Basically, a lot of health plans that are gotten through employers are covered by a federal law called ERISA that basically preempted anything for certain covered plans that went beyond federal protection. Like, it preempted state laws that went beyond. And so here in Oregon, we had explicit protection for gender identity. That went beyond Title VII, arguably. Now there's no argument. It does not go beyond Title VII. We absolutely can apply that to those plans. So I think that's a fairly substantial hurdle that a lot of people were running into in like employer health insurance context, that we should just feel confident going forward that that's not going to be something we're going to have to deal with.
Great, thanks. And then we've actually gotten 3 questions regarding healthcare. And one is, someone was asking, saying they're under the impression there needs to be a person impacted by the change at the federal level before it can be challenged by the court, and just wondering if that's the route to fight back against the administration's rollback, or what the sort of, if anyone has a sense of what the federal fight is around 1557 rollbacks.
I can jump in and talk a little. I'm not going to talk about federal standing requirements for Article 3 courts. But for those lawyers who are maybe paying attention, like, that's a little bit about what that question gets to, and how a lawsuit can be brought when there's a change in a rule. So I think the short answer for the person who asked the question is yes. In most cases, you need to have somebody who is impacted by the rule change. There are some exceptions to that that I just won't get right if I try to do them off the top of my head. But frankly, with the breadth of this rule and the fact that the Trump administration continues to try and push out these rules, even though they clearly go against what Bostock said, which was, I think, frankly, like a very clear decision that says people should be protected by laws against sex discrimination, regardless of their gender identity, right? Like, essentially, that is what Bostock stands for. So it is baffling to me that the Trump administration would continue to push these out, except for, right, that they're essentially trying to pander to their base and like drum up transphobic support for this election in November, even if it makes them look like fools in the court in the meantime. So so I would say that, yes, that's true of the standing requirement, but it's not exactly true in the sense that there are going to be a lot of different legal mechanisms that we can use to go after people. And sorry, I don't know why my printer just turned on, but it is very loud. I'm going to put myself on mute.
Thanks for that. And then we had another question, and as you all know, right, that there's a disproportionate number of trans folks who receive their health care through Medicaid, which in our state is the Oregon Health Plan, and wondering if there's any immediate effect on Medicaid funding from the federal government to state governments because of the ruling. Seems like Kylar's jumping in, but on mute.
No.
No. Yeah, that's what the answer is just no, right? That hasn't happened.
Nancy, I'm sorry, I missed the question trying to correct my printer issue. And this is like that typical Zoom conference call that's happening right now these days where like something is distracting and now I get to be that person. Could you repose the question?
Sure. Is there any immediate effect on Medicaid funding from the federal government to the states because of this?
No. Yeah, I'm sorry. You just answered that question perfectly. No, there is none.
Yeah, I was going to say I hadn't noticed any, but I'm not in all loops anymore, so I wasn't sure. But thank you. I'm glad he knew the answer. So I was calling on Ian. I was going, help Ian or somebody. That's what I was saying, Nancy, mouthing.
And then the last question on healthcare before we move on to another topic, which I think is in direct response to what you were saying, Nora. If you're litigating a case when people are denied coverage or surgery, is there an advocate or support organization to help trans people through the process?
I think what I would say, there are a lot of organizations on the ground doing really good work. Like I mentioned, when it was a case that I worked on it a tiny bit, but I can't take any credit whatsoever. But Talia Guerriero and the NCLR is the National Center for Lesbian Rights. They have done tremendous work picking up cases like this. I think they're often a great place to start. I mean, it's something that I think is often a frustration for people who do run into kind of, run-of-the-mill discrimination, that these organizations will not necessarily have the capacity to take on every single case, but they're at least a very great place to start. And National Center for Lesbian Rights is one, Transgender Law Center, Lambda Legal, Basic Rights Oregon. I work with y'all a lot, and where you guys are really good at kind of being a conduit to find attorneys, because often what will happen is that eventually there will be a private civil attorney, but it can be hard to figure out who to talk to, and you don't know, what that structure is going to be or if somebody can take it on. But, reaching out, ACLU of Oregon, another great starting point. And there are going to be places like that in your state. I mean, I think that's kind of my best answer there. Is just often your local rights orgs will know at least how to point you towards people who can be more active in helping support.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So maybe we can switch topics a little bit and talk about the positive news that we got in June around employment non-discrimination. And so I wanted to start with Kylar because 7 years ago in 2013, you wrote a piece called Why ENDA is an Urgent Issue for People of Color. And of course, we never got ENDA as a law, but the recent Supreme Court ruling essentially guarantees the protections the community sought through ENDA. How do you see this ruling impacting the BIPOC community specifically?
Well, it helps. Is what I'll say. It helps. I think there is lots more work to be done. While I want to I definitely want to celebrate the moment and the victory, and I think it helps a lot. But there's lots of work to be done around employment and people that are of color in this country, and the anti-Blackness that we never deal with. And it's been very interesting as I see it continue, having been a child of the civil rights movement to now being an adult now. One of the things I say is, thank God my parents are dead. Say that. And I never would think I would say that because they were wonderful and also my best friends. But seeing the struggles that we still have that have permeated my life as an adult, I would think we would still not be having these struggles. But I said to people, because they were so clear to me what they were, people didn't believe me until the election of 2016, and some people are still in disbelief that we still have the struggle around anti-Blackness, not just racism, and they're two distinct things. And now I make sure to talk about them when I go out, because even in our movement, I don't think we get that issue of the difference between anti-Blackness and racism. And I think that there is a big disconnect, which is why we have people take to the streets. And I won't get Dr. King's quote correct today, but what I will do is do a slight at it and say that people protest after they have not been heard for so long. And that's when people take to the streets. Because I'm a gentle, soft, and I'm actually an introvert. And people don't realize that because they see me on panels and they see me talking all the time. But spend a day with me and you'll learn that I'm an introvert and that I don't talk very much and that I'm very quiet. But because I get outraged over injustices, and I do, this sounds strange and weird and crazy even to me, but this is my calling, and I know it is my calling because I was given to two strong people that made me and loved me in a time where there was no knowledge about any of this transgender stuff, and that they were Black people in a time where Black people didn't have power and still honestly don't, but they really didn't. But they were proud of me and taught me to be proud of myself, and gave me power to speak out and speak beyond the haves of other people, and to never be ashamed of who I am, and to teach others that same thing, that I knew this and I know this is my calling. And when both those people left this planet, I knew that I was lonely and empty, because they covered me from the age of whatever till now with my gender non-conformity and my color or race non-conformity, if you will. So my point is that no, we didn't get ENDA. We did get this ruling, and I do think that's extremely important. But there are further conversations we have to have about how people of color are treated in the workspace, and about how Black people in particular are treated in workspaces. I have been actually stressed out to the hilt in regard to that, because I have been overqualified for almost every single position that I've held, but treated less qualified for those positions. And it's been very evident to me, just like almost every Black child is put in special ed because they're considered problem children and not worked with, which was my joy being a professor at a historically Black college, because I was able to reach people that had been throwaway people. And now I am so proud to say that I even touched those people, because they're out flying the world, flying planes, running corporations, and doing wonderful things. So the point is that we have to do more work around people of color, all people of color, to treat them as equals in this society. And we have a lot of work to do in this country, sadly, as we see with the 2016 election and what is carried from there. So I'm excited about this decision, but we have work to do with implementation and education around communities of color, and in particular, Black Americans, and the struggle for equity, not equality, but equity in this country.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Ian, I know the ACLU represented Amy Stevens, and in this really important case, were you surprised given the current makeup of the Supreme Court on the day it happened?
Yeah, well, I first wanted to just kind of build off of the really important points that my friend, who I've not seen in so long in person, Kylar, but I'm looking forward to that day when we can hang out again in person, Kylar. But that Kylar was just lifting up about, kind of what the real goals should be for us as advocates and a movement. And of course, this might sound, somewhat strange coming from an organization like the ACLU, but at the end of the day, the goal for us is not winning in courts or passing new laws, although we see those as important steps that move us in the right direction. But what we are all fighting for, what we are all working towards, is an actual lived equality or a lived equity. To Kylar's point, that's really the kind of transformational change that we're all working towards. And of course, court decisions and new laws are important along that road, but that is not the ultimate destination that we're hoping to find ourselves at. Yes, the decision was very bittersweet for us in the sense that we absolutely recognize what a historic and landmark a decision it was for the LGBTQ community. But at the same time, our hearts, break that Amy did not live long enough to see that victory, or that Don Zarda was not alive to see that victory. Two of the three named plaintiffs in that case did not live to see the outcome of it. So we definitely celebrate the decision and what it means for our community, and we reflect on Amy and Dawn and so many others who never got the chance to see that day. And we just kind of use that moment as a time to rededicate ourselves to all the work that is left to continue to do.
Thank you for that. And I want to ask Nora and Matt to weigh in as well, because I also felt like that was a very bittersweet day for the reasons that you mentioned, Ian, and also just knowing in Oregon that we've had this law for 13 years and trans people still aren't hired or are, underemployed, and that it wasn't a magic bullet, right, as far as really creating lived equality in our state. So, Nora, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. And I think it's obviously a great point and really fundamental that these laws are important. They're very important to have this legal recognition, but it is by no means sufficient to get us to where we need to be in terms of people actually being treated equally in the workplace. And even here in Oregon, our statistics are terrible, especially for trans women of color, especially for Black trans women, in terms of people facing discrimination, not being able to get hired. It's something even just as a trans woman working downtown, like I'll talk to people like, where are the other trans women? They're not here. They're like, people are pushed so far out of the city in segregation, economic segregation, because there's so few opportunities, even despite our legal protections. And, some of the hardest cases that I've worked on and some of the hardest intakes I've had has been working with trans people who moved to Oregon specifically because of our legal protections, like people who moved from places like Louisiana and Texas specifically to find a place where they would be protected. And then people who all they want to do is do a good day's work, take so much pride in their job, and just want to, contribute. And then they get here and have faced employment discrimination for the first time in their lives, actually. And suddenly they're talking to me out of a job, and just the pain and the anger there. I mean, those are some of the hardest cases, honestly, for me to hold in terms of, living in the state of Oregon, just people recognizing that, no, it is absolutely not, a panacea to have these laws in place, and that, this reputation we have, is separate from the lived reality on the ground for so many trans people. But yeah, I can kick that over to Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for kicking us off. I mean, I think that's incredibly important. What Nora just said was definitely my experience too when litigating at the ACLU of Oregon, right? You would, and just lived experience talking to trans and BIPOC people, both non-binary, trans, and even cisgendered folks here about the experience of discrimination. And in fact, recently, if you're interested in it, Partners in Diversity put out a study about why. So it's a little, you'll see the focus is very much on businesses, but they put out a study about why people of color would come to Portland to take, these are people who they studied, are people with a graduate degree, come to Portland, stay for 2 or 3 years, and then leave for another business hub in the United States. And it was astounding. Like 96% of the people, like hundreds of people who were interviewed, like 96% of them said it was because they had experienced discrimination here. It was either 96 or 97. It was very, very high. And then the thing that was really telling for me was that they all said almost uniformly, again, like 96, somewhere in the 90s percentage, that people in Portland believed that they were more progressive than they actually are. So our laws are really strong, but if you don't have access to a lawyer, if you don't have access to the knowledge that you should have access to a lawyer, right? Like if you're not in these networks, if you're not watching the Bro presentation right now, you are you're still on the margins, right? And you're still impacted. And I think if I'm being particularly cynical about why the Trump administration would pass these rules in the face of a Supreme Court decision like this, it's because they know that people will be discriminated against in places even where there are state and local laws, because they are sort of like giving the green light to open discrimination, even where it's still prohibited by law, because chances are you're not going to have access to a lawyer. You're not going to know to call the ACLU or Transgender Law Center or Nora, if you get fired from your job. So that's the part that's like deeply scary to me, is like how many people, no matter how much we try to reach out, are we missing? Because I think those people who aren't already sort of like in the fold are the folks who are most likely going to be impacted, no matter what their local laws are.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I feel like the people most marginalized, right, are the people who are houseless right now. And that HUD ruling was really awful. Ian, can you speak to what happened with the housing and urban development and houseless folks, and what that ruling was and how it affects people?
Yeah, certainly.
If I may, before you start, Ian, I'm going to have to excuse myself, and I do apologize. I have another commitment, which is right now, and I hate to leave this call. This is so important, but I am double booked right now, and I would love to hear what Ian is going to say. So thank you, guys. It's a pleasure, and let me bug out now and let Ian give his answer. So
thank you, Kylar. We love having you here.
All right, thank you.
So with respect to the Trump administration's Department of Housing and Urban Development, first of all, you would think that coming off of the Bostock decision, that would have been a humbling experience for this administration that has premised so much of their assault on the LGBTQ community on the incorrect understanding that LGBTQ people are not protected under federal civil rights law. Now that the Supreme Court has definitively said that is in fact not the case, you would think that the administration would step back and kind of reassess what they have been doing. But very much not the case. Just weeks after the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock, the Trump administration proposed a rule to roll back protections for trans people experiencing homelessness specifically to allow taxpayer-funded shelters to turn away trans people based on a number of factors, even including the shelter provider's own religious views. And, I would say that a rule like this would be disgraceful, shameful, dangerous, life-threatening at any point in time when it's proposed. I mean, this is really intended to discriminate against truly the most vulnerable people in our country. But at a time, as you were laying out, Nancy, and others on the call today, where we are facing, such economic devastation because of the pandemic and increased homelessness and people who are facing eviction, that at this particular point in time, the administration, rather than trying to take steps to prevent the devastation of mass evictions and increased homelessness in our country, would actually be proposing something to make it even easier to discriminate against people experiencing homelessness is just truly appalling. And so it's important to note that the proposal that the Trump administration is putting forward is not a final rule, which means that this is something that will be opened up for public comment, and that's very important. And we want to encourage everyone, whether they are doing it in their capacity with an organization or as individuals or whatever the case may be, but to loudly voice their objections to this proposal to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We expect there to be approximately a 60-day comment period. So that would put the comment deadline probably somewhere in the early fall time frame, probably like mid to late September. And then they'll have to go back and kind of review these comments before they can issue a final rule. So I would say that my hope is that that they will not be able to actually roll something out until their very final days in office, and that it is something that can be quickly reversed or challenged or whatever the best strategy ultimately will be to go after it. But it's an appalling rule, and it really flies in the face of the Bostock decision, and it's but it's certainly something that we can organize against and fight, and that's exactly what the ACLU is intending to do in the weeks ahead.
So is it something where we should flood the comments like those K-pop kids did around the Tulsa rally?
That's
Let's
exactly
just get the K-pop
right.
kids on it. Let's just get the
Yeah. Sounds great.
Let's say
Yeah, Nora?
I wanted to piggyback on that. I mean, I know that people say a lot, the cruelty is the point often with the Trump administration, and just the way that particular rule was written. I mean, just sitting there as a trans woman, and like that in the CFR, they are going to put a manual for how to spot a trans woman, and just the most demeaning stereotypes, that. That just it's frankly kind of shocking to see that in 2020, and it's a reminder of just kind of what we're up against in terms of the people who are in there now and kind of why they need to not be in there now. But also just and raising the intersectional point again, because what that really does, it's centering access to shelters in traditional notions of womanhood inseparable from whiteness. We know that the people who are going to be hit by this the most and hurt by this the most are people who fall outside of those stereotypical modes, especially trans women of color. There's huge histories that I don't need to explain to anybody, but of how those are already leveraged against the most marginalized people in our communities. But yeah, I would put on just sort of a substantive, a little bit of a point of caution that when we're talking about what the Bostock ruling meant, what I wish it had said that it didn't was that trans women are women. I wish it had said that. various different kinds of discrimination that we run into in these kind of rules. And one of them is the because of sex. Employment discrimination because of sex, that's kind of like one of the broadest topics we can be looking at. Because really, in that context, you're firing someone. There's a huge raft, like anything touching their gender can fall into that. There are other areas where it's permissible to draw lines. And I think that is part of why they think they can push some of this stuff forward, because they're saying, like, well, we didn't get a ruling that said trans women are women. We're just drawing a line. And I think Bostock still gives us a lot of great, gives us so much ammunition to fight that, but that's part of why they think they can move forward, from my perspective on that. But because they're leaning into these stereotypes of like, well, basically they're telling trans women that you're really men and you're scary and you're bad, and just seeing that encoded in the CFR is just, it's shocking, like I said, to be here in now and see that being pushed in those ways.
Can you explain what a CFR is?
Code of Federal Regulations, administrative law. That, like, the black letter law of the United States would tell you how to spot a trans woman. I mean, it's just, the cruelty is the point, right?
Yeah. I'll admit, I saw the headline and I was like, I can't even read this. It's just too painful.
Another piggyback on that is, I read that, and for people who haven't met me in person, like, I'm pretty short, and like they listed 3 specific attributes. Honestly, none of those are things that I was likely to run into. A lot of cis women I know are going to run into that. This is what we find with bathroom policing, is that it is cis women, as often as not, who are getting singled out for being gender nonconforming. Butch cis women, and especially women of color, especially black women, are getting singled out and excluded, and it doesn't even have to do with their trans status. And cis people are actually really bad at this, in terms of, picking their, figuring out who are the targets they're intending to hurt. And it affects everybody. It really does. And, that's something that people need to keep in mind when they're seeing rules like this. Like, there are a lot of cis women who need help in shelters, who are going to be turned away if this rule goes into place.
Yeah.
Matt? Yeah, I was just, thank you, Nora. I had the same reaction that you did, Nancy, when I think the article first came out on like the 2nd of July, like Vox broke that story. And then there was subsequent article that had the things like, look for somebody's height, look, do they have facial hair or not? Do they, and it was
Adam's apple.
An Adam's apple, right? It was grotesque. And my point for this is like, in some ways, right? And this may sound sort of dark, but let me sort of like go there, which is that like trans people, especially trans people of color, face extraordinarily high rates of housing discrimination already, along with the other forms of discrimination that can lead you to needing this service. And there was like just some numbers, right? Like in 2015, there was a survey, and I don't remember if it was, I can't remember who did this survey, I'm sorry. But basically it surveyed 25,000 TGNC folks, and almost 30% of the transgender people reported experiencing homelessness at some point in their lives, and even more, almost 70% of those people reported being discriminated against in a housing shelter. So, I mean, we're already talking about a system that is like grotesquely stacked against people, even with, certain protections in place. So stripping them away, and this is the thing that I keep on getting back to, is it's like this rallying call. It's no longer a dog whistle, right? It's a rallying call to openly discriminate against trans and gender nonconforming folks. Which is, I think, why it's so important to do what Ian was saying to do, which is to continue to sort of fight this notion that we will unify behind discriminatory practices by unifying behind an active request for, practices that are protective, by, participating in common periods, by writing your senators and calling them. I mean, people think that they don't listen, but they actually do listen to all of those calls. Like, somebody is paid to listen to those calls. And it matters. It especially matters in states where we don't have a strong federal delegation like we do in Oregon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we actually just got a question about someone was asking the best way, and it sounds like with this ruling specifically, there's the comment period, but in general, what's the best way to fight back against these rollbacks and protections? Is it through petitions, donating? I'll just add voting, or more. What are folks' thoughts about all the best ways to really fight these attempted rollbacks and rollbacks?
Number one, all politicians are highly imperfect. Voting is a very limited thing. It is also probably, we have federal troops in Portland right now who are governor, and all of our politicians are telling him to go away, and they're telling us no, pound sand. That's kind of what the Trump administration is doing in only slightly more polite terms on trans rights. So, the key thing is to get them out. That's number one. And we get them out through voting. So as imperfect a mechanism as that is, and as, all of the caveats, that's really going to be the thing that's going to turn the tide on this.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Matt?
So taking it from sort of macro all the way down to micro, one of the things that I can say I've sort of experienced through firsthand is finding out what your local shelter is, who are providing these services, whether they are continuing to provide services to trans people, and donating or volunteering time with those shelters. These places are often very understaffed and have to turn people away because they don't have the funds for beds, etc. So there are actually ways that you can get involved and have, it may be a tiny, tiny, tiny little impact right here, but if one of the folks who are listening in right now actually helps a trans person feel welcome as they're going through this very, very tumultuous crisis, essentially, that can be life-changing.
Thanks. Nora, did you want to weigh in? Yeah, go ahead.
The complete other side of this from voting, I'm kind of extending what Matt was saying. If somebody wants a good action item coming immediately out of this, go on Twitter and search trans fundraiser and throw some money at a Black trans woman. Seriously. Well, no, fun people. There's this joke in the trans community that we're all getting, people are just passing the same $6 around each other's GoFundMes, that people rely on each other more than anything. We have this big debate about corporate pride versus the legacy of Marsha P. Johnson. And it's the people in Marsha P. Johnson's shoes, it never really changed. People are still relying on each other, need material support, dollars, support shelters, support organizations, just support people directly. And places like Twitter are good places to start to try to find people to help out.
Yeah, and I would say that I think that Matt and Nora have made excellent suggestions. I will just underline everything that they said. And I would say, for folks that are specifically interested in fighting this particular regulation, there is a great resource hub at housingsaveslives.org. Many of our organizations are listed as supporters of that effort on there, including Basic Rights Oregon, the ACLU, a number of others. That'll be a great way for folks who do want to lift up their voice and comment in objecting to this rule to go to housingsaveslives.org. And you can certainly, be able to take some action steps from there.
Great, thanks. And yeah, for bro folks who are watching this, please know we'll have it all over our social media when it's time to comment. So we've mentioned a couple times, and it's there are federal troops in the streets of Portland right now, and grabbing people off the street, putting them in vans. It feels very dictatorship and feels really scary as far as I don't think people are being read their Miranda rights. I don't think, like they're like normal rules aren't applying, which feels not okay. I don't know if is what's happening at this moment constitutional, or like it just seems illegal or something. I don't know. It just feels wrong. Any hot takes on the lawyerly view of what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Nancy. Hot take, completely unconstitutional. You can't just detain someone randomly. I don't care if you Mirandize them, right? Like there's still other laws that apply around both the U.S. Constitution, around the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, around the Oregon Constitution, that protect people. And frankly, every single state has constitutional protections against illegal detention. So what is happening in Portland right now, what is being threatened in Chicago and other places where the Trump administration just like doesn't like democratic leadership, is totally abhorrent. It's grotesque. It is an extension of the violence that we've been talking about that is happening both at the administrative level and now literally in front of our face through the use of troops, right? Through the use of militarized law enforcement, which I think of as the military in some ways, and just showing up in our neighborhoods. And we literally have to pay attention to this and speak out against it. DOJ, Oregon DOJ filed a lawsuit trying to get these troops out of town. As Nora said, like the federal administration has basically said a big, we don't care to you, but I think that we will likely see success in litigation. The problem is, right, like litigation takes a long time. And in the meantime, there are people like the folks interviewed on NPR and frankly, again, like the people who we're not hearing about who are heavily impacted by this. So you're right to be appalled by that. People should be appalled and should be speaking out.
Yeah, it felt like that twin thing in the same week of like, coronavirus numbers have to be sent to the White House, not to the CDC. And also we're sending federal troops. And it was just like, this feels like the start of a dystopian novel. But it's happening right here, right now.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, Nancy, I mean, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez tweeted out last night something that, you would never, I mean, even just going back a few years, you would kind of be like, as bad as we thought it was going to be, like I didn't know that it was going to, actually come to this point where she would tweet out, the United States of America should not have secret police. And, the fact that that is in any way a controversial opinion, I mean, it just shows you where we have devolved to as a country. I just would underscore everything that Matt said. The ACLU last week actually said that what is happening in the streets of Portland is an unconstitutional nightmare. And it is because of that, the ACLU filed suit against both the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Marshal Service. Obviously these law enforcement officials are, have indiscriminately been using tear gas and rubber bullets and acoustic weapons. Federal officers, of course, on July 12th, shot a protester in the head with a rubber bullet, fracturing that individual's face and skull. And so what the ACLU lawsuit is seeking to do is to block federal law enforcement from dispersing, arresting, threatening to arrest, or using a physical force against journalists or legal observers. And so, I expect that, I'm sure, like Matt mentioned, that the Oregon Department of Justice is also fighting back against the administration. I'm sure that, we'll see, even still more litigation over this, over the administration's conduct. And, I mean, fundamentally for us, at the ACLU, we really, believe that, we are not going to just stand by and allow the government to respond to protest against police brutality with brutality, and we are completely committed to holding law enforcement at every level of government accountable. And so, but the fact that we have even arrived at this point is so both just incredibly demoralizing and really terrifying. Also.
And I'll add too that it shows the interconnectedness of issues and the importance of paying attention to what's happening, to all kinds of people. Like these troops that are in Portland right now, those were developed through the militarization of CBP, of ICE, of anti-immigration forces. Say like immigration is a trans rights issue too. It's had such impact on LGBT, trans asylum seekers and immigrants. But like, these people were already here and they were doing this. They were coming into our communities. It's just they were harassing, groups that maybe not everyone was paying attention to. And suddenly everyone's like, well, what are these people doing here? Like, they've been here for a while. And the pattern of this administration, they don't care that it's illegal. They just have faith that, number one, it's going to take a long time to hold them accountable. And by then they'll have moved on to these other things. And unfortunately, our Supreme Court has been very quick to, stay decisions that hold Trump back and allow things to move forward that he has been doing. That's an unfortunate kind of pattern that's been emerging, at the Supreme Court. But I think it really is, these didn't come from nowhere. This has been building through 3 years of targeted harassment, especially for immigrant communities and everything like that.
Yeah, it's a really important point.
And Nancy, can I just add one quick thing that wasn't
Sure.
mentioned? Just like additional kudos to the ACLU. The ACLU of Oregon, prior to this lawsuit that Ian was talking about, secured a temporary injunction against local law enforcement for essentially the same thing, right? Using this force against protesters and legal observers, people who are very, very clearly not engaged in the kind of violence that the Trump administration is using, I think falsely, frankly, to justify the use of force in this way. And they did secure a temporary injunction. What the federal officers are saying, and so for folks who are listening, a temporary injunction essentially means like the court has said, you have to stop doing this behavior. The federal administration has turned around and said, that doesn't apply to federal officers. It only applies to local law enforcement. So we're going to keep doing it using federal officers, not the Beaverton and Portland police. Now ACLU National is stepping in with some additional stuff, and just like really an important case that people should be following.
Yeah, thank you. And then we have another question from our viewers, which is, are there places where Oregon law needs to be shored up to further protect trans people?
I feel like Nora is the expert on this. So I don't know if you want to take this, Nora, but I'm also happy to like take a stab at it if you don't.
I mean, so in terms of where the laws are, we do, as we've mentioned, Oregon does have, generally really strong anti-discrimination law. Our 2007, our Equality Act added gender identity and discrimination, kind of through a back door by redefining sexual orientation is in all of our statutes, and in the statutory definition that includes gender identity, which is actually really, really expansive. We're kind of people are talking about kind of making that more explicit, but it's already there, and so that includes discrimination in housing, public accommodations, healthcare, on and on and on and on. Like as we've talked about, though, the material reality can be a little different. Having anti-discrimination laws, I think supporting your local unions is a great. I say as a union lawyer, I might be a little bit biased there, but I mean, queer rights are union rights. Like one of the problems with the anti-discrimination law is that it can't usually get ahead of actions. You're suing because you're already out of a job. Organizing workplaces is a great tool to kind of help you stay in your job and prevent that harm from the front end. One issue that's been kicking around, the really tragic story, Nikki Kuhnhausen's murder in the last year in the Portland area has really shaken the community. Nationally, there's a lot of attention to trans panic defense bans, and I know that's something that's been coming up. There's a lot of debate around that issue, but I know it's something that's being talked about quite a bit. But I think we really, the focus often is beyond these non-discrimination laws at this point, because now that we have that part covered, it's like, okay, where are we falling short? What organizations need support? How do we best get the support and change the culture in a lot of ways? But I'll kick it over to Matt.
No, I mean, I think that was all beautifully said, Nora. I think the thing that I was going to say was that Oregon, in particular, I think with the work that Basic Rights Oregon has done, has really led the way in creating good statewide legislation to protect people. It isn't, for me, there aren't like big obvious gaps, right? Where you see the gaps is in the execution of these laws, right? We all know the difference between what it is. Well, let me say that. I imagine that there is a difference between being an out non-binary person in Portland and in Clackamas Falls, right? Or in Pendleton, or in like Ontario, any of those places where you're going to places where we being like the nonprofits who are trying to do this work, trying to make sure that laws are implemented fairly across the board, don't have the kind of penetration that we would love to have, right? And so what I think what we need to figure out collectively as a community is how to support rural queer people, BIPOC people, both in rural and metro areas, and how to be the most effective advocates on behalf of implementation at this point. So a lot of our resources, I think, should be around implementation, and what Kylar said beautifully at the top of the hour was lived equality.
Carrying that forward, I mean, when we talk to people, it's not that clamoring for new trans-specific laws, it's housing justice in Portland. Making sure that people can afford their rent, that they have places to live and access to medical care. I mean, we're at the point here in Oregon where we've covered, explicit trans protection. That's what people really need more than anything. And so, there's a lot of organizing and advocacy around, for instance, housing policy in Portland right now. That's going to have a huge positive impact on the trans community, depending on the way that goes.
Yeah, and I'll just weigh in on this. I think that we're always looking at all the tweaks we can make, and whether they're in the law or administrative changes that we can help influence. So like, if I read something in LGBTQ Portland that someone submitted a name and gender change and then got the forms sent to their house in their dead name, I'm like, this is a system fail. Let's fix this, right? And so I think we're always looking as Basic Rights Oregon to find what can we address, to actually create equality and lived equality in our state, because it's so necessary, right? Even those small little tweaks. So tell us about them, because that's where, we're fighting for you. And so, we only have about 5 more minutes. And so I just want to wrap us up with, anything you would like to share about the current fight we're in for LGBTQ folks in 2020 in the United States. A big, broad question, but, you have a minute to tell us anything you're feeling. And I might start with Ian, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say that I hope that we will soon have an environment at the federal level where we do not have to dedicate so much of our time and energy and resources and fight into opposing kind of one regulatory assault after another, but can actually begin to take steps to move progress forward for LGBTQ people, for non-binary people, for gender non-conforming people at the federal level. I know that, there is so much that will need to be rolled back and undone from the terrible things that this administration has done over the course of its 4 years. And, I hope that as a community, we are still able to envision, like, what are the leaps forward that would actually move us, in the direction that where we want to head. And I just urge us not to limit our imagination to things that will take us back to January 19th, 2017. Because we want to be far beyond there in terms of the type of things that we're fighting for this community. But I'm hopeful that in the next couple of months we'll be able to begin at least taking the steps to move all of that work that needs to happen forward.
Thank you, Ian. Important that the normal wasn't that great. We need to be fighting for the vision we want and the world we want. And I think that's so important. And also important, the winner of the Protect Trans Kids tote bag is Be Kill 2003, but we don't have your address in our system. So please sign the form that is linked in the comments, and congratulations. Matt, would you like to wrap up?
Sure. I mean, look, what I will say is that there are just so many things happening every day that are atrocious coming from the Trump administration that it is easy to feel sort of hopeless and to sort of succumb to the the feeling that I've struggled with it, right? The feelings of depression, of isolation, and it's brought on more by this pandemic that we are in the middle of. And something that I have been reminded of every single day, essentially, since March and things started to slow down and then shut down, is like the tremendous power of community. Even folks who can't be out on the street. So there are the people out on the street protesting and just like mind-boggling numbers, right? Just saying like, this is just totally messed up and we won't stand for it. There are people who are doing that same kind of activism through Facebook, through Instagram, through Twitter, like in just, again, mind-boggling numbers. Every day I see somebody who reminds me on like their Instagram story that Breonna Taylor's murderers haven't been arrested yet. And like using these tools in a way to come together in the face of tragedy. And I think it's a testament to the human spirit. And I think, frankly, it's a beautiful thing. And if I take one thing away from 2020 is that in the face of a global pandemic, queer and BIPOC people like rose up and told their government that this was not acceptable. So very true. Also, like 2020, the year of mutual aid, really making a comeback. Nora, do you want to close us out?
Yeah. So, obviously we are in the middle of a backlash, and this Trump administration is like backlash personified against, all kinds of justice movements. But, so like I've been doing a lot of work around identity change issues under Oregon law. And something that strikes me all the time that I always have to remind myself. So I started law school in 2010. And at that point in time, the transition that I did in the career that I've had was like illegal, was not legally possible. And, I think a lot of us will go back and think like, why didn't, as a trans person, you often have like, why didn't I do this 10, 15 years earlier? And you realize just how different the world looked. And government policies notwithstanding, just we are all so much better connected, so much more visible. There is so much more ability to connect with one another, and there's so much strength in the community as a community that is connected and can hold hold each other and hold each other up and build this resilience. And so it's something that I'm constantly reminding myself that no matter how dark it feels to read how to spot a trans woman in, regulatory contexts. We're not fighting it alone in the way that it felt 10 years, 15, 20 years ago, that it felt growing up, here in Oregon, in the same way. And, I think that's what's going to carry us through.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you all. Thank you for your words. Thank you for your work in the world. And keep fighting. Keep loving, keep fighting. Thank you. Bye.